From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, speaking to you as always, or as lately, from Mumbai, India, although, I don't know if our listeners really care about that anymore. David Feldman, my co-host, is in New York City, and of course, the man of the hour, Ralph Nader, speaking to us from his outpost in Washington, D.C. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you very much, David. And Steve, let's get underway with our very, very important guest today.
Our guest today is Dr. Ken Reed. He's a sports policy director for the League of Fans. You can go there at leagueoffans.org. Ralph helped found this. It's a sports reform project. Dr. Ken Reed is the author of How We Can Save Sports, a Game Plan, is a longtime sports marketing consultant, sports studies instructor, sports issues analyst, columnist, and author. Ralph, please welcome Dr. Ken Reed.
Welcome, Ken Reed. He was also an athlete in college and a coach, so he's really done it all. His marketing experience led him to change careers and call me up and say he wanted to do something really important because he sees a lot wrong with sports, amateur and professional. From my point of view, I was always interested in sports, in part because if it absorbs billions of hours of people's time at all ages, whatever you think of it, it's important, just for that reason alone. But there are a lot of other reasons why sports is important, and we're going to cover those with our interview today with Ken Reed. Ken, let me ask you the first question. You're coming out with a new book this month, and it's a book unlike any book I've seen on sports. You have books on sports, on various sports, baseball, lacrosse, football. You have books on sports figures like Lou Gehrig or Billie Jean King. You have books on themes like taxpayer-subsidized stadiums as a waste of money and not very job-creating. But your book covers the whole waterfront. It's like a sports manifesto because, as in so many things in life, everything is connected to everything else, and you give a number of themes. So give us the title of your book, who published it, what it covers, and what your two principal themes that go through the whole sports experience from middle school to the professional sports as a red thread.
Well, thanks, Ralph, and I appreciate being on your show. Yeah, the title of my book is How We Can Save Sports, a Game Plan. And the game plan is because not only do I look at 9 key issues, but I also come up with some recommendations and provide resources for anyone out there who wants to be a budding sports reformist. It's kind of a game plan in terms of how you can attack some of these issues, whether it be at the local level or the state level or the national level. But just to give you a quick background, you touched on my sports experience. I'm the son of a coach, and sports have been a part of my life since I was a little kid, and I love sports, even though some people that read some of my stuff might question that. But I do love sports, and the reason I got into this position with the League of Fans as sports policy director and wrote this book is because I think sport can be so much better than it is. It's really turned from a great experience for people as part of the human spirit into a spectacle that's primarily commercial in nature, and a lot of the key aspects of sport are being lost. So the reason I wrote the book primarily is to look at ways where we can enhance the positive and kind of mitigate the negative for it. And the interesting theme that I came across in writing this book and the various chapters on the various issues is that every single one, whether it's youth sports or professional sports, comes down to policies that are basically ego and greed driven, and what I call win at all cost, or WAC, WAAC, or profit at all cost, PAC, PAAC. Every single one, whether it's the local Little League that's trying to make more money off the kids and adults getting too involved, or if it's the professional level where franchise owners that are self-regulated monopolies are ripping off taxpayers to get new sports palaces built. It's amazing to me how the same thing goes throughout all levels of sports.
That's a good start. Let's take your two themes here. Start them in the most difficult area. It's easy to say win at all costs, profit at all costs for the NFL, the football league, the baseball, the basketball. Start how all this affects 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds, middle school athletes, those who play and those who watch?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the first place to start in the United States, it's one of the few, if not the only country, that doesn't have any type of national sports policy or regulation. It's basically self-regulated monopolies, whether you're talking the NFL, NBA, NHL, or even the NCAA. And that filters down to the college level, which filters down to the high school level, which filters down to the youth level. And when you get down to the youth level, what used to be sandlot baseball of kids getting together and playing for the love of the game eventually became Little League Baseball, which was organized by adults. And that started out fine. And then eventually that became so commercialized that now it's a national broadcast every year. And then after that, we had high school sports, which were part of the educational endeavors at all schools. It was another classroom, if you will. Well, then along came club sports. With the popularity of sports, adults saw opportunities to create AAU basketball or club sports where they could get involved, make money themselves off the kids, stage these tournaments that make lots of money, create clubs where they get hundreds and hundreds of dollars from parents with a not so subtle promise of college scholarships in the future. And it's just kind of warped the Little League experience. Now these kids don't play with their friends in the neighborhood. They travel all over the state, all over the country. They're many professionalized athletes, even at 9, 10, 11 years old.
Ken, explain the role of parents here at a very young age, the extent to which they get caught up in this fervor and lose perhaps some of their perspective or frame of reference.
Well, I think almost all these parents have good in their heart and they want the best for their kids, but they a lot of times go about it the wrong way. A lot of them like sports and are frustrated athletes themselves. They didn't go as far as they wanted, so they want their kids to do better. So they want to get the best opportunity for them, and they end up spending hundreds of dollars with personal trainers to make them faster and stronger, and they try to get them on travel teams. And what the perspective they're losing is that very, very few kids at 12 years old end up playing college athletics, and even fewer of those get any financial aid for it. So there's hundreds of case studies out there, thousands of case studies of parents spending thousands of dollars on their young athletes that if they would have put it just in a savings account at the bank would have a lot more money for their kids' college education than any hope of college scholarships.
What kind of pressure is this put on the children?
Well, it's kind of a conditional love, if you will, because these kids aren't dumb. They know that mom and dad are putting them in the minivan, driving them all over town, spending hundreds of dollars to make them better athletes. And they also see the positive feedback they get when they play well or their team does well. And on the other hand, the negative feedback if they don't do so well. So it's pretty clear in their minds that my mom and dad love me, but they love me when I'm a great athlete. And so it's kind of like a lot of these kids wake up terrified. I've talked to kids that on days of the game, they get nervous stomachs and almost nausea because they feel they have to produce in order to get acceptance of their own parents.
Well, something has now emerged that you were talking about and warning about many months ago, which is early concussions, not just for college players and professional. It's a big issue now. You have 2 daughters. They were playing sports in school. And when you learned about the concussion potential, is it true that you took your daughters off playing soccer because of the heading with the soccer ball? Even that is not as benign as a lot of people think. Do you want to talk about your own personal experience here in the last couple of years, Ken?
Yes, it was a very tough decision, obviously, but the more concussion research is one of our biggest issues at League of Fans, and I think it's the number one sports issue in the country. And I started to dig into it considerably, first because of the NFL issue and then college, but I discovered the real issue is the thousands of kids that are playing sports, football, soccer, whatever the sport is around the country, is the main problem that no one talks about, or not to the degree they should, because there's no trainers on these sidelines, let alone doctors. I mean, it's run by coaches that aren't even qualified to coach a lot of times. And so you're young kids with brains that are most vulnerable in the early stages of development are putting their heads and brains at risk with very little protection. In the case of my daughter, I discovered that it's not just concussions that we need to be worried about. It's the repetitive subconcussive impact that occurs over and over that can lead to the same problems, the chronic traumatic encephalopathy that we hear about with NFL players. Over time, a lot of these neurological problems can occur without even having concussions, as long as you're getting repetitive subconcussive impact like linemen do in football, where they just constantly bang their heads. Well, in soccer, and in particular girls soccer, in youth and high school, is the sport with the second most concussions after football. And most people don't realize that. But soccer, as most people know, heading is a big part of the game, where they strike the ball with their head. A lot of times these balls that they're heading are coming as upward of 50 miles an hour. So if you do that constantly during the game, it takes its toll. There's been several studies where they looked at the players before the game and after, and on cognitive tests, they performed significantly worse after the soccer match. Another one compared college women's soccer players and women's swimmers before and after the season, and the swimmers actually improved on the cognitive test, whereas the soccer players went down. So looking at this, and the age of my daughter at the time was 13, and she was also involved in other sports, basketball and tennis, etc., it just made sense to my wife and I that as much as I love sports and believe that they can produce positive in terms of teamwork and leadership and dealing with adversity, etc., there's plenty of sports to choose from. And to put your kid in harm's way when you know what's going on when that ball strikes their head, or that a lot of times they'll run into each other head on head when they're trying to hit the ball, or they fall and hit their head on the ground. There's a lot of ways it happens in soccer, but it just didn't make sense, and so we made the tough decision to pull my daughter out of soccer.
How did she react?
Well, as you might expect, there were tears initially. A lot of it was based not so much on I can't play soccer, but my friends and teammates. But fortunately for us, we had a backup because she was also on a basketball team, and after a couple weeks, it seemed to go fine, and now, a couple years hence, she's doing well and seldom mentions soccer at all anymore.
We're talking with Dr. Ken Reed, the policy director for League of Fans and the author of a brand new book, the likes of which has never been written, called How We Can Save Sports, A Game Plan by Rowan and Littlefield Publishers, and it's available electronically as well. I wanted you to point out of something very important in this book that is of particular interest to me, because I read the sports pages almost every day, and they're mislabeled. They should be called the spectator sports pages, because they have almost no reports on local participatory sports that occur all over the country. You make that distinction. Increasingly, the vast majority of sports fans are spectators. They're often eating, chewing, watching the games, gaining weight, not having exercise, not going outside and playing a game of hoops or whatever, unorganized sports, and a very tiny percentage of ever more accomplished athletes. You want to digress on that a little bit?
Well, we're coming off the Super Bowl, most watched TV show ever, I think, is what the early ratings are showing. And people think of the United States all around the world as a sports-mad country. And in reality, we're spectator sports-mad country. Fewer and fewer adults are participating in sports. They're getting their sports fix, like you said, watching games on TV or their computer, whatever. And fewer kids are playing now, going out for sports. They're playing sports on video games, etc. And there's a lot of reasons for that. There's specialization in sports at a younger and younger age, and kids are getting pushed out because youth sports are becoming more and more for the elite only. Our schools have dropped intramural sports, which used to allow all kids to participate. Physical education classes have been dropped. So there's fewer and fewer opportunities, and the societal pressure, if you're not an elite athlete, you don't need to be playing, is pervasive.
Yeah, this is a very important trend that you pointed out, that the less organized sports, like intramural sports at colleges, universities, or just a sandlot baseball game, or simply fungo hitting the ball to a friend who's catching it and throwing it back to you. I mean, I always loved less organized sports, but the more less organized sports are taken off the table and they are not supported at our schools or at our recreational fields, the less people will participate at that low level of entry, at that low level of time allocation. And I thought that point in your book is extremely well taken. David, did you have a question?
I think Steve did, but I do too. But
okay,
Steve,
go ahead.
Ken, I wanted to know, would it be possible, you talked about the header in youth league soccer, could you ban the header from youth league soccer, just like in some other youth leagues where they have different rules? Is that an approach?
Well, I definitely think that's the approach, and it should be at least before high school, they shouldn't allow headers. But ideally, all the way through high school, but by the time you're an adult, then it becomes a little safer just because the brain's developed further. But
Right.
unlike football, where I don't think you can really change the game unless you go to flag football, it's very hard to take tackling and blocking and head contact out. But soccer, I have no idea who invented soccer or why they would say you can't use your hands and arms, but you can hit with your head. It's beyond me, but it seems like you could catch balls off your chest, drop them to the ground, or even allow arms to some extent, and still the game would look pretty much like soccer. I mean, diehard soccer players, of which I'm not one, will cry that heading is integral to the game of soccer, but I don't think it has to be, at least at the younger ages, for sure.
Doctor, could you elaborate on the prefrontal cortex and what needs to be left alone, especially with teenagers?
Well, that's where the executive function, decision-making, and cognitive abilities on making decisions reside, and that's why that's such a dangerous area to mess with during the development stage. It can really slow down cognitive development all the way through high school.
Teenagers' ability to determine risk is affected by the prefrontal cortex, as I understand it. And if you mess with that, boys end up doing a lot more dangerous things. Is that true?
Exactly, and there's a chance they can become more violent, all types of things that could go wrong if that development is slowed in any way.
Behind the wheel of a car?
Sure, yeah.
Ralph, you had talked about the low level of entry in sports and how important it is. Steve Scrovan played football for Yale, and I'm curious, it seems to me, Steve, you were part of organized sports at Yale. You no longer play football. And I wonder how many kids who were part of organized sports who plan to get into college based on it or play professionally continue with that sport when they're adults, whereas guys who played softball, I would suggest that studies show that if you played in your backyard, wiffle ball, you're probably still playing it. Don't people get turned off to sports once they play it?
Well, especially in the United States, you know, in Europe, they have a club system. In fact, competitive sports are rarely part of high school or colleges in Europe because if you want to work on being an elite athlete, you go to school and then you go to the club. And those clubs over there have opportunities from about 6 years old all the way up, you know, to 60 plus. Adults can play for the clubs as much as the kids. And here, basically, once you're done at 18, you're tossed out the pasture. I mean, there's not a lot of clubs for adults to play any sport, let alone football. There are rec leagues at the recreation departments, but it's just much less of part of the culture here of adults playing sports than it is in other countries.
There's never Heidelberg University against Oxford. There's none of that because they all have clubs that are separate from the universities. Steve, why don't you tell us how you let Princeton beat the heck out of you when you were at Yale?
Ralph, I will have you know, sir, that when I was there in the 4 years, freshman through senior year, my class, the class of 1979, holds the distinction, which I believe still holds, we never lost to Harvard or Princeton, especially not to Princeton.
Oh,
Case closed.
Oh,
you stepped into that one, Ralph.
We'll change the sub. Yeah. What position did you play?
I was a safety and punt returner. I played running back all through grade school and high school and became a defensive back in college. So I was.
So you got hit in the head a lot.
Well, not as much as the linemen or the linebackers. Being I don't know what evidence you're using for that, Ralph. I'm trying to blow right by that question.
You're returning a ball, they're going to really go for you.
Yes, when you're a ball carrier, you're going to have that happen. But when you're returning punts, that only happens a few times a game. But when I was in the really heavy action in college, I was 15 yards behind the line of scrimmage. I wasn't the kind of position that was getting hit on every play, not like the lineman and the linebacker.
Actually, Steve got hit in the head so many times he almost had to transfer to Princeton.
Oh, God. And you're a comedian, David?
Ralph, you can get him on basketball because I'm sure Princeton was beating him in basketball.
That's right. In those years, Princeton whipped
Yes,
Yale.
I had nothing to do with basketball. See, my job on the football field basically as a safety, it was my job to run up to the pile, pat everybody on the butt, and say, nice hit. So it was,
Another really important point that I thought Ken has brought to the forefront is this debunking this idea that tough coaches produce winning teams. You know, real hard-ass coaches produce winning teams. You want to discuss that and tell the listeners about this remarkable coach who for over 40 years at St. John's College in Minnesota did just the opposite.
Yeah, well, I call it the Lombardi effect. I mean, in this country, the old Green Bay Packers coach, Vince Lombardi, was the old militaristic coach that kick him in the butt. One of his players had the famous quote that he treats us all the same like dogs. And so that's kind of been the model for coaches in not only football, but basketball and other sports. And the sad part is that filters down to the youth level. And so the guy that's working the 9-to-5 job gets a clipboard and whistle and goes to the field, and he thinks he's got to act like Bobby Knight or Vince Lombardi. And it's not physically abuse, at least verbally abuse these young kids, and it takes the love of the game out of them. And I think it was interesting. There was a study I think I touch on in my book that nothing predicts success like finding the endeavor fun. And so John Gagliardi, who you mentioned, is at St. John's, he's retired now. Retired as the winningest coach in college football history. Coached at the Division III level, so he's not that well known. But he turned the Lombardi effect on its head and basically came up with a set of rules where they didn't use pads during the week. They didn't tackle hardly any during the week. They had short practices. He kept them fresh. They didn't do calisthenics. The players called the plays, not the coaches. I don't have the list in front of me, but it was a whole different philosophy that was proved to be very effective, obviously. He's the winningest coach of all time. He had hundreds of kids going out for the team. He had no cut rules, just a very progressive style of coaching that proved that it can be effective, and you don't have to kick them in the butt and be the militaristic type autocratic coach to be successful.
He was really brilliant. There's no question about it. For example, I did a piece on him for national television. I went up there and I said to him, how can you have practice during the week before the Saturday game? You don't have them tackling each other. He said, well, it's really quite simple. I don't want them to get hurt and I don't want them to get exhausted. So when Saturday comes, they're as fresh as they can be against the opposing team. And he was such a low-key guy, a wonderful man. He's written a book on his experiences, John Gagliardi, St. John's College in Minnesota. But there was a big-time coach that you cited, John Wooden of the UCLA Bruins basketball team.
Right, yeah. Wooden was picked the all-time coach of the 20th century, I believe, and won 10 national titles in 12 years. One of his famous quotes is, I didn't want to force him to be at practice. I wanted him to be at practice. He never swore at him, treated him with respect. And, there's others too. Dean Smith at North Carolina, similar style. Even in football, guys like Don Shula and Bill Walsh were known as coaching from the heart and being players' coaches. And, Walsh was one of the winningest coaches, so was Shula. So,
what teams were they with?
Shula coached the Colts and the Dolphins. In fact, he was the coach of the Dolphins when they went 17-0, the only undefeated team in NFL history. Tony Dungy's a more recent guy. It's the Colts, very much a low-key, positive reinforcement versus negative reinforcement coaching style.
These people really debunked myths. I'll never forget the statement by John Wooden, the winningest college basketball manager of all time that you just referred to out of California. He said, sports do not shape character. Sports reflect character.
Right. What's interesting with coaches, and I touch on this in the book as well, is that we allow coaches, even with our young kids, to get away with stuff that if you did that in the classroom and called kids what the coaches call them and treated them like coaches treat them, you'd be fired as your job as teacher and might even be put in jail. But for coaches, we just wink and turn our head and say, that's old coach XYZ, and we let them get away with it. It's
this
great.
gets us to the topic of $4 or $5 million a year football coaches at Big Ten universities or the Southeast Conference, and athletic scholarships and the scandal. Do you want to say a few words about all that and how to reform that, Ken?
Well, first of all, I mean, I love college sports. I love college football and college basketball. I love the ideal of actual students playing for their school, which still exists to a large degree at Division III. But we're talking, I think there has to be a distinction made between big-time college sports, which is at the major colleges, the Big Ten, the ACC, the SEC, Pac-12, those kind of conferences versus a small liberal arts college in Iowa. When we're at big-time NCAA college football and basketball are pulling in millions and millions of dollars, and yet the kids have a salary cap, if you will, of tuition and room and board. A lot of times they don't even cover the cost of attendance. A lot of the fees and stuff aren't covered, and that makes it almost impossible for some of these kids from the demographic areas they come from. I think it's the civil rights issue of our time. It's a total economic injustice that these kids are putting their blood, sweat, and tears on the line while the coaches are pulling $5 million. They're getting a chance to sit in a class, and that's it. They can't make any money off their likeness. They can't sell calendars. The schools sell jerseys with their name on them and make the money. The players don't get any of the jersey sales dollars.
And they're shortchanged in their education. I mean, they go to these colleges like Ohio State, Alabama, Arizona, Oregon. They go to these big-time universities on athletic scholarships. And basically, they're under the control of their coach from dawn to dusk. They're not under the supervision of the academic departments. And the coaches put pressure on the academic departments to give them gut courses and gut grades. And tell them about that scandal in North Carolina that just was exposed a year ago.
Well, what happened in North Carolina has happened for decades now, but basically they had an assistant to the program that was helping players write phony papers and go to phony classes and getting grades that they never actually earned. Like you said, the coaches own these players. When you're under scholarship, they determine, and what's happened is the scholarships are only good year to year. Most people think you get them for 4 years. Some schools are going to start doing that again.
That's the reform you're talking about. You're reforming it that way. So the scholarship doesn't get suspended in the sophomore year if the student doesn't perform athletically on the field according to the standards. Yeah, if they show up and work hard, they shouldn't have their scholarship pulled. If they're pulling their weight in the classroom and doing their best on the field, it's the coach's mistake. But these coaches have traditionally taken kids like this and made them run at 6 a.m. up the flights of the stairs in the stadium until they puked, and trying to get them to give up their scholarship so they can bring someone else in. And so then you're left with a poor kid who goes off to State U, goes 1 year, and then is tossed to the curb, and they have no other resources.
Wow.
That's one of the things I'm recommending. That the financial aid office should control these scholarships just like they do every other type of financial aid, and take it away from the athletic directors and coaches. And if the kid's performing as best he can on the field and doing in the classroom, then it should be up to the financial aid office whether that scholarship is maintained, not the coach.
That's amazing. So you're saying the coaches want to get rid of the financial aid for a specific student, so they'll just torture him till he quits?
Yeah, it's very similar. Wow. It's professionalized athletics at the college level. You see NFL teams in training camp, they'll cut certain players and bring others in. Basically, you get, say, 20, 25 scholarships. I don't know what the annual limit is in college football, and say 5 of them don't pan out like they would like. So they got to run those kids off so they can get other kids on scholarships.
So the kid thinks it's his fault.
Oh, yeah.
He blames himself. Wow.
And that's why there's a movement. There's a movement now to pay big-time college athletes. Get rid of the farce, the fraud, the belligerence, recognize it as a entertainment, maybe separate it from the university with a nonprofit corporation, a little bit moving toward the club version in Europe. We're going to see more of that, don't you think, Ken?
I do. I think it should be a subsidiary under the umbrella. For one thing that's really bothers me is that big-time college sports are considered nonprofits because they're under the umbrella of the educational institution. And to think that Michigan football or Kentucky basketball is a nonprofit educational endeavor is just absurd. It's one of the best money-making schemes going because they don't even have to pay the athletes like the NFL does. They're making similar revenue. The NCAA tournament in basketball brings in billions of dollars.
When the University of Alabama last year shut down their football team, a lot of critics said, well, that's stupid because college football raises money for the college. Do other parts of the university benefit from college football financially?
Well, it's conceivable, and in a few places they'll donate money towards a library or something. But what happens is it's an accounting exercise, and so as a nonprofit, they can't show profit, so they move dollars and cents around through accounting practices. There's no way. You listen to some of these coaches, they'll say, you know, we're breaking even or losing money on our football program. And you go, what? If you look at the numbers from the TV revenue, the club seat revenue, the concessions, the season tickets, the licensing deals that they make them pay just to buy season tickets, and then you subtract the cost of scholarships, which is just basically a counting exercise. They're not actually having to pay those scholarships. They just take them off the books. But they're making huge profits, you know. And they'll put those dollars back into new facilities like Taj Mahal training facilities and dorms, and they'll bring in chefs to feed the players, and they'll use all that money in different ways so they don't show a profit. But
David, the point I think Ken makes in the book is that there's very little transfer of big-time sports profits like football over to the educational side of the university. For example, there was a study at University of California, Berkeley, that debunked the prevailing impression up to the study that the Berkeley football team contributed a surplus. It turns out it actually cost the university over $10 million a year. It was a deficit. There are a few universities like Notre Dame that get the national TV money that have a surplus. But as Ken pointed out, very little of this goes into the educational budget. It just revolves into more and more elaborate facilities, stadiums, coaches, salaries, and all the rest. We're out of time, unfortunately. You've been listening to a discussion of a new book by Dr. Ken Reed, just out, called How We Can Save Sports, a Game Plan, published by Rowan and Littlefield Publishers. It's full of solutions, not just diagnosis of all the problems and abuses in sports from middle school through the professional and even the retirement area. It covers the deliberate fighting in the National Hockey League, where they have people on the bench who they put on the rink just to fight, just to beat up each other. And those have suffered grievously in terms of head injuries and even worse. So there's a lot more in this book, and I hope you can pick it up, How We Can Save Sports, a Game Plan. And look at our leagueoffans.org for commentary by Ken Reed, who also has a column weekly on Huffington Post. Thank you very much, Dr. Reed.
Well, I appreciate the time, and I think it's an important subject, and you know, we can't just treat sports as entertainment and a diversion, that we need to look at these issues more seriously.
Indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's very good. Thanks, Ken. We covered a lot of ground.
You're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. We'll be back right after this.
Stand up. Oh, step up. Rise up.
From Pacifica, you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org.
Oh, step up.
Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan along with David Feldman and Ralph. And we were talking to Dr. Ken Reed of leagueoffans.org, who's written a new book, How We Can Save Sports, a Game Plan. And I forgot to mention that he comes from the Littleton, Colorado, in the Denver Boulder area, where we are on the air, one of our affiliates, KGNU in the Denver Boulder area, 88.5 FM, 1390 AM. But Ralph, I want to switch topics here and refer to a column you wrote a couple of weeks ago, which was entitled, How Birth Year Legacies Can Better Our Country. First of all, what is a birth year legacy?
It's a takeoff from alumni classes at various colleges and universities who make gifts to their university as an alumni class, class of 57, class of 72, class of 94. It occurred to me that there's another affinity group that might improve our country enormously far into the future, and that is to take the birth year of Americans, say 1937, 1942, 1929. There are up to 3 million Americans in each one of those birth years. They were born in that year. And I thought, well, what if some people in a birth year, let's say 1940, would say, we are going to get together and we're going to contact all Americans born in those years to start a nonprofit institution all over the country that will make the country better in perpetuity, will endow it. And I brought together about 25 examples. They're not the only examples. As I say at the end of my column, be my guest from any birth year. Maybe it starts with a few rich people, and then they get together some less rich people. But they have some serious numbers out of the 3 million or less people who are born in that year. And so I gave some examples. For example, a birth year gift to America could be to organize after-school clubs for youngsters that advance civic skills and civic experience right in their hometowns, in their local communities. That would be a spectacular incubator for strong, self-reliant, informed civic advocates long after they graduate. It's sort of like a farm team strengthened progressive democracy. Another example I gave was they can award moral courage awards in all 3,007 counties in the U.S. to recognize and support those great Americans who speak out, who stand up, who show up against injustice or abuses. Very often, when these people do what they do, they're ostracized. They're looked at as if they're pariahs. They may lose their jobs. So we could have public moral courage awards in all these counties to establish a new standard of recognition for human behavior, bringing your conscience to work, bringing your conscience to your local environment, to your local health institution when you see something terribly wrong. And then we'll all remember, Andrew Carnegie, who made a lot of money in the steel industry when it got underway over 100 years ago. He was a Scottish immigrant, and he ended up in Pittsburgh and elsewhere. There's a dark side to the way he treated his workers, but he decided to give his money away. And he wrote a book called The Social Gospel. And the memorable phrase was, a rich man who dies rich dies in disgrace. And he literally gave, I think, over 90% of his money. He was a multi-billionaire, obviously. And one of the things that remains to this day are the Carnegie Libraries. He basically said to communities around the country, you provide the land, I will pay for building the library. And today and tomorrow and next week and next year, youngsters and adults are availing themselves of these Carnegie Libraries. There are over 3,000 of them in the United States. Imagine if he just gave his riches to an opera, or he gave his riches to his relatives. What would people think of Carnegie now? How much better is this country now because he built those libraries in communities that often had no libraries whatsoever? And I have in this column, which is on nader.org, you can look it up, how birth year legacies can better our country. I have, over 20 examples like that. For instance, in endowing departments of civic practice in universities and colleges so students can learn how to practice democracy, civil rights, and civil liberties, not just learn how to run a computer. Another example that a birth year consortium of Americans, let's say the birth year of 1932 or 1930, they could set up advocacy groups around the country in congressional districts to advance full Medicare for all. More efficient, everybody in, nobody out. Free choice of doctor and hospital, none of these narrow networks. And it's far more cost effective, saves more lives, has simpler billing procedures, like almost no billing, and far less complex. It doesn't torment people every day that are being tormented trying to figure out the complexities of Obamacare. Another example, a birth year project, would be to establish an annual civic activity day, let's say Columbus Day, all over the country, where people show up for citizen engagement. They spot a project or a need in the town, and they try to improve it. One could be how to get more people to turn out for town meetings and referendums and elections. And every year there would be one civic activity day. Another example for a birth year project would be a movement to simplify our laws, get rid of unnecessary red tape over complex forms people have to fill out, like for Medicaid. and get rid of the omnipresent fine print contracts that we all have to sign on the dotted line. Insurance policies, the little card we sign when we open a bank account, the installment loan, the landlord leases, page after page of one-sided pro-vendor fine print, taking away our rights to go to court, letting the seller change the terms of the contract unilaterally without our consent. That would be a big one. One of my favorite is a birth year project to organize congressional accountability watchdog groups in all 435 congressional districts. That would turn the balance of power away from the few who now dominate the many, the Wall Street over the Main Street, into the hands of the people. And we'd have a remarkably different members of Congress going to Washington, D.C. But I say at the end of the column, by now you may be thinking of your own proposals and wondering how you can launch these birth year legacy gifts. Well, out of each birth year can come those who have the means, the time, the imagination, the skills to jumpstart the process. Each birth year can have its own unique approach to establishing future betterments that can be operated in perpetuity, that is, endowed. And they don't have to be national. They could be regional, New England, for example, the Northwest, or they could even be birth year people in a community or a county or a locality. It's just a way to increase the spirit of civic activity, the spirit of democracy, and really come to grips with our country's deterioration, decay, decline, the concentration of too much power in too few hands, the war machines, the empire. We can do a lot better. And we're only going to do a lot better when we find affinity groups, and I think possibly the most powerful ones of all would be people who shared the same experience as youngsters, such as people who grew up during the Great Depression or the notorious Depression in the 1930s, or who went through World War II. Those are real affinity groups, and they want to look at their descendants and posterity, as Jefferson taught us to do, and say, what are we going to leave behind? How can we leave a better America for our children and grandchildren? And if anybody wants any more information about this, they can go to the following website. They can contact us at info@nader.org, info@nader.org, or write to us. I'd love to get letters on this, to P.O. Box 19367, Washington, D.C. 20036, for some preliminary advice on how to get it underway. Obviously, it could be really jump-started by some very enlightened, very rich people in one affinity year after another. I think we could start with people who are 90 and go to people who are 70 for starters. 20 birth years. Not that you can't have older people than 90 or younger people than 70, but that's the time frame, I think, that has the greatest potential for getting these birth year institutions underway. What do you think, Steve and David?
I think that's a very ambitious idea, and I wanted to ask you, this sounds a lot like a thing you did at Princeton, if I'm not mistaken, at a reunion. You have an organization, you formed an organization called Project 55 because you graduated from Princeton in 55, right? Is this based on the same template?
I think so. I think it's an affinity group all over the country, a birth year. But in my class at Princeton, I got tired of going to reunions and all they tried to give us a lot of beer and the tents, the reunion tents, and ask us for contributions, alumni day. I didn't think this respected our intelligence that they purported to cultivate when we were at Princeton for 4 years.
Was Donald Rumsfeld in your graduating class?
He was in the class of 1954, one class ahead of us, a happy-go-lucky Princeton Charlie, we used to call him, with khaki pants and white buck shoes. And who would ever have thought
that he would have contributed so much to our country?
That he would have become a certified war criminal. The latest book by that prisoner who was tortured in Guantanamo. He was tortured under a program personally ordered by Donald Rumsfeld as Secretary of Defense. Wow. It's a perfect example of the situation, turning someone who knew better. He was head of the poverty agency under Nixon, the Office of Economic Opportunity, before he became a CEO of a drug company in the Midwest, how the situation can turn a person into implementing horrendous criminal, torturous deeds in terms of wars of choice, most notably the invasion of Iraq, unconstitutionally, illegally, the destruction of that society that did not threaten us, the loss of over 1 million Iraqis, over 6,000 Americans, and tens of thousands of American soldiers traumatized, injured, or sickened, and trillions of dollars. And what's the result? An Iraq that's erupting in sectarian violence, civil wars, and more destruction of that society with millions of refugees.
A couple of weeks ago, Henry Kissinger was testifying before John McCain's Senate Armed Services Committee, and they got interrupted by Code Pink. And Senator McCain called Code Pink lowlife scum and said, "How dare you treat a 91-year-old man with a broken arm, Henry Kissinger, this way? He's one of our country's greatest statesmen."
Yeah, he supervised the illegal bombing of Cambodia. He did terrible things against rebels and demonstrators by funding the dictatorship of Indonesia with U.S. arms and diplomatic coverage. He did nothing when he could have done a lot to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian crisis, because he had quite a lot of prestige with the Israeli government, and he had, of course, Nixon's ear. I think Cy Hirsch, in his book on Kissinger, got it right. A former Harvard professor who turned into a war criminal, a purveyor of empire. He has a sense of humor, and he's always used that in his social occasions to give himself a more benign impression. But he was a power player of not very beneficial results for people abroad, not to mention our country. But I want to get back to Princeton Project 55. By the way, the Code Pink people,
Yeah, that's what
they protest, David, because they're never allowed to testify in the committee where they're sitting in, ever. And so they're shut out. And the only thing that gives them a voice is stand up for 30 seconds, shout out some phrases, hold up some placards for the photographer before the police hustle them out and send them to temporary imprisonment.
When Henry Kissinger testifies before the Senate, he comes from New York. Who pays for that?
Oh, I'm sure he pays his own way. The committee doesn't pay for your travel, except for exceptional circumstances, such like dire poverty. And I don't think Kissinger is a multimillionaire with his Kissinger Associates consulting firm can claim dire poverty. But back to Princeton Project 55. Well, to my surprise, we got together about 15, 20 of our classmates and kept meeting and meeting until we started a nonprofit foundation called Princeton Project 55 to give fellowships and internships to Princeton undergraduates for summer and postgraduate activity in established citizen organizations around the country that were dedicated to systemic change. They were not soup kitchen groups. They are necessary, but it was systemic change. And we really deliberated, our classmates, for some hours about the difference between charity and justice. Charity being palliative, immediate to a problem, a need like hunger, like disability, like impoverishment, like homelessness, and justice, which basically drives to change the contours of a society so it is more distributive to people who earned it, higher pay, minimum wage, full health insurance, adequate housing. Justice prevents the very injustices that invite charity. And we were going to definitely focus on justice. And then we went to Yale and tried to get Yale 55, Steve. They weren't quite up to it. There were a couple, but they didn't get to that critical mass of 15 or 20. The same for Harvard. However, we had a diffusion project, and we did get a lot of colleges and universities to start awards. They didn't start a full-time group, but they had awards, scholarships, things like that, sponsored by a particular alumni class. We had a very surprise gift that some of the fellowship people went to Silicon Valley, made some money, and they gave us a mansion right outside the confines of the Princeton University campus, so that our staff of 7 or 8 full-time staff for Project 55 could have a headquarters. And they donated the mansion. They gave us some money to buy the mansion. So now it's been transmuted into something called Princeton Alumni Corps, which is tapping into all the classes. So it can happen all over the country to put whole streams of improvement and solutions into play on the ground, because there are a lot of alumni classes 35 years and out when the alumni are starting to ask themselves, how do they move from success to significance and get something done for their country?
Well, very good. Ralph, you were telling us that something's happening in Canada over civil liberties. Like, they're crushing civil liberties. It doesn't sound like Canada. Not the Canada that I know, Ralph. What's happening over there?
I think what's happening to Canada is a question the United States has an interest in, because for so many decades, we took ideas developed in Canada and adopted them here. Like 80 million people belong to credit unions. Guess what? That idea came from Quebec to New Hampshire over 100 years ago to set up the first credit union. We did a book called Canada First, where they're first in innovation, social service, technology. The first radio station, the first oil well was in Canada. The first transatlantic undersea cable, the first children's museum was in Canada. The first many things. And so Canada helps us because, you know, when we want to get things done in the U.S., it helps us to say, hey, it's already been done north of the border. And they actually look like us.
Right.
So
what's going on there now with civil liberties?
What's going on now is that they are copycatting George Bush and Dick Cheney in a smaller way. From being international peacekeepers through the UN, they supported soldiers to join our soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq. Very un-Canadian-like. Their role was peacekeeping. They were known as people who were refuge nation, Underground Railroad, fugitive slaves over the border. They couldn't be brought back. They went into Canada for freedom. On the Vietnam War, protesters, conscientious objectives went to Canada. Well, Canada had a bad reaction to 9/11. They passed a law that began to restrict freedom of civil liberties and freedom of speech. But then they had 2 shootings recently with 2 police dying in Ottawa, and they overreacted the way Bush and Cheney did. And they are proposing, under the premiership of Stephen Harper, the Conservative Party premier, they are proposing a draconian new law that would allow preventive detention, that would allow incarceration for speech, not action, and allow people to be put on no-fly lists and to have immediately their travel cut off. It's a lot of discretion for a lot of new police resources and spy resources in Canada. Some of the other parties are beginning to object. The civil liberties groups in Canada are beginning to object. But you see, this illustrates this epidemic of overreacting to terrorism when the overreaction itself has 2 consequences. It metastasizes more stateless terrorism. Look at the metastasis of Al-Qaeda and ISIS into countries like Libya, Somalia, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, not just Afghanistan, Pakistan, Southeast Asia, North Africa. That's what we've gotten for our overreaction. And second, look what it's done to us. Militarized our society. You got a bridge out there that needs repair. You have a school out there that needs renovation. Too bad. The money's going to blow up schools and bridges. Oh, so sorry. Terrorism in Afghanistan and Iraq. See? So it's affected us in terms of where our tax dollars go. And of course, it's affected the military families here. It's affected the soldiers, the huge traumatic syndromes, families ripped apart. For what? For illegal criminal wars perpetuated by people like George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, continued in some ways and some greater ways like drone wars by Barack Obama and Joe Biden. I think this great book that's just come out by a professor at Tufts called National Security and Double Government shows what's happening to our country. Our constitutional processes are being submerged and overwhelmed by a dedicated, persistent, profit-oriented, ideologically driven military-industrial complex that transcends both Republican and Democratic parties. And that is exactly what President Eisenhower warned us about in his farewell address to the American people in January of 1953. You can get it online. President Dwight Eisenhower's warning about the military-industrial complex on our country's priorities, on our country's freedoms. You can get it online in January 1961, when Dwight Eisenhower completed his 2 terms and opened the doors to John F. Kennedy.
And 1953, there was another speech that we had talked about.
Yeah, 1953 was this great Cross of Iron speech before the National Society of Newspaper Editors in Washington, D.C., where he listed how much a tank costs, how much a battleship costs, how much a bomber costs, and said, imagine if we use that money for our schools and our roads and our hospitals. Why are we living this way with the Russians? We can destroy them. They can destroy us. That's no way to live a life. That's why he called it the Cross of Iron speech. No other president since has said so specifically what the cost of aggressive militarization is to the American people. Isn't that a commentary?
And no other man brings up President Eisenhower's other speech about the military-industrial complex. You're the only one who knows about both speeches.
And they're both at the tips of your finger on the internet. Spread them around. Start discussion groups. Everything starts with the people back home.
Well, I think we've actually come to the end. My name is Steve Scrovan. On behalf of David Feldman and Ralph Nader, you have been listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you for joining us. We had Dr. Ken Reed on talking about sports and League of Fans. Join us again next week. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, Ralph.
Goodbye, David. Goodbye, Steve. And goodbye, listeners. Spread the word. Get more radio stations. Increase the number of our listeners. Have living room discussions. Roll up your sleeves. And remember that the only way we have a daily democracy is to have a daily citizenship.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too